Good morning and welcome. My name is Francesca Giovannini. I'm the Executive Director of the Belfer Center Project on Managing the Atom. And I sincerely want to welcome you all to this conference, 3-day conference on nuclear safety and security after Chernobyl and Fukushima, lessons learned and forgotten. I want in particular to welcome people not only in the United States, but around the world who are joining at different times. Some very early in the morning, some very late at night, and we are really very grateful that you have decided to spend some time with us thinking through the challenges ahead to strengthen the global nuclear safety regime. In particular, I want to welcome our friends and colleagues from Asia and our colleagues from the Gulf who have joined in high numbers this conference. So thank you so very much for being with us today. In a minute, I'm going to introduce you to Professor Matthew Bunn, who is the faculty chair of our project, who will lead us into an introduction to our conference, our expectations, our assumptions in designing this 3-day conversation, and what we hope to get out of this extraordinary lineup of speakers and experts in the audience. But let me just walk you through a few housekeeping announcements that are quite boring, but necessary to make this conversation fruitful and productive. First of all, let me mention that this conference, all the parts of this conference are going to be recorded. However, while this virtual event is on record, the event organizers prohibit any attendees, including journalists, from audio, visual recording, or distributing parts or all of the event program without prior written authorization from the organizers. In terms of the Q&A, we would like to invite you all to be very active and raise your questions in the chat. But please, if you care, please do add your name and institutional affiliation so we can actually attribute the question as we raise it to our panelists. Let me also mention that for each day you will have to register. So if you're interested in joining us tomorrow and you haven't done so already, please go to our website and register. Same for day 3. If you intend to use social media and you want to tweet your thoughts about some of our ideas and discussions, please do so. But please also make sure that you add at Managing the Atom to your link so that we can follow along with you on social media. And finally, let me mention that this conference will break at 11:15. We will reconvene at 11:30 for a special session that the Belfer Center Managing the Atom Project will co-host with the Institute of Politics. In order to join the special session with the IAEA Director General Grossi in a conversation with David Sanger of the New York Times, we will post you on the chat a specific link that you will actually have to use to join that session. So please make sure you check the chat. We'll actually post the link throughout the morning and also close to the closing of our conference. So remember, you have a specific link to join if you're interested in attending the special session with DG Grossi. Now, without further ado, let me introduce you to the mastermind of this conference and also to my boss, Professor Matthew Bunn. Now, Matt certainly doesn't need any introduction to this crowd, but let me just point out a couple of things. He is the James Schlesinger Professor of the Practice of Energy, National Security and Foreign Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and the faculty lead for our project. He has co-authored more than 25 books and book-length technical reports and over 150 articles and publications ranging from science and nuclear technology to foreign policy and the Washington Post. The Matt's achievements go beyond his many awards and accomplishments. And I want to say a couple of things on a personal level. Through his class on controlling the world's most dangerous weapons, which he co-teach with Professor Will Tobey, continues to maintain nuclear issues on the agenda of the Harvard Kennedy School. And he continues to recruit talents to this field. He's a very thoughtful leader, deeply committed to bring a wide range of opinions to nuclear discussions. And under his leadership, and thanks to our wonderful fellows, last year, Managing the Atom Project launched a series of seminars to discuss inclusion and diversity in the nuclear field. A And finally, he has consistently been able to successfully bridge the gap between policy and scholarship. And he has done so through his research, through his engagement with the policy community, and through his mentorship. So it is my great pleasure to introduce you Professor Matt Bunn, who will then take over from here and deliver an overview of the conference and lead the conversation forward. Thank you. Matt, over to you.
Well, thank you, Francesca, for that excessively enthusiastic introduction. And I want to welcome everyone to this conference exploring nuclear safety, security, and governance on the anniversaries of the Fukushima and Chernobyl disasters. The Managing the Atom project, based at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, is pleased to host this conference as part of celebrating our own 25th anniversary. We have a remarkable set of speakers to explore these issues over the next 3 days, and I want to offer our thanks to all of them for being willing to offer us their time and their insights, especially those for whom the time is very early or very late. I especially want to thank Rafael Grossi, Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, for taking time from his busy schedule to speak with us today. That portion of the conference, as Francesca mentioned, is co-sponsored with the Kennedy School's Institute of Politics. I want to thank the remarkable team who helped put this conference together, especially Francesca, but also Will Toby, Aditi Verma, Ali Ahmad, Mariana Bujarin, Jacob Carosa, and Gretchen Bartlett. I want to thank the students and others who are helping us take notes and keep the conference moving. And I want to thank all of you who are listening for taking part. The nuclear accidents at Chernobyl 35 years ago and at Fukushima Daiichi 10 years ago were epochal disasters, displacing hundreds of thousands of people, damaging ecosystems, disrupting countless lives, and reshaping societies. They also changed government, utility, and public approaches to and perceptions of the risks and benefits of nuclear energy. The radiation health effects were significant, but were dwarfed by the enormous economic, social, political, psychological, and industrial impacts, which reverberate down through the decades. Mikhail Gorbachev had his 90th birthday yesterday, and he is among those who have argued that the Chernobyl disaster was actually a significant one of the factors that led to the collapse of the Soviet state he led. The Fukushima Daiichi disaster, combined with the devastating earthquake and tsunami that caused it, have reshaped Japanese society as well. In this conference, we want to reflect on the impact of these accidents, the lessons learned from them, and the lessons that perhaps remain unlearned or have been forgotten. What actions the world community has already taken to prevent such catastrophes in the future, and what further steps are still needed, and how societies can best manage nuclear energy and other complex technologies, listening to the voices of both citizens and experts. These disasters were accidents. No one wanted them to happen. But in a world of terrorist groups with global ambitions, there is also the possibility that a catastrophic radiation release or even a nuclear explosion could occur as a result of intentional human action. Hence, after the Fukushima disaster, a number of countries, including Japan, reviewed and strengthened their nuclear security arrangements, as well as their nuclear safety measures. For that reason, we will explore both safety and security at this conference. Effective safety and effective security, and a functioning interface between them, should be seen as crucial investments in protecting the public from radiation releases and crucial enablers for the future of nuclear energy. Coming out of this conference, we hope that we will take away insights that will help each of us play our parts in preventing such disasters from ever occurring again, to remain vigilant and not become complacent. A number of the speakers from this conference will be outlining their ideas in short pieces for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And our Managing Atom team will produce a short report synthesizing key takeaways and recommendations from our sessions. So we count on our panelists and our extraordinary audience to ensure a lively and engaged discussion throughout. With that being said, let me introduce our first session, which will be a conversation with Professors John Holdren and Allison MacFarlane. John Holdren served as Science and Technology Advisor to President Obama and Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy for the whole 8 years of the Obama administration. including playing a leading role in the US response to the Fukushima disaster, working closely with Japanese experts. He has been a powerful voice in the US debate on energy in general and nuclear energy in particular for decades, and has won more prestigious awards than I can name here. And he was the founder of Managing the Atom more than 2 decades ago. Today, he is the Teresa and John Heinz Professor of Environmental Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and co-director of the school's Science, Technology, and Public Policy program, as well as having a position in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. Allison MacFarlane was chair of the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission beginning just over a year, after the Fukushima disaster. Also working closely with the Japanese and playing a leading role in decisions about what US regulators should do in response to the accident. She too has been a major voice in debates about nuclear energy and nuclear waste, serving among other things on the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future in the Obama administration, and as chair of the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists some time ago, which sets the famous doomsday clock. MacFarlane started her policy career as one of the first fellows in Managing the Atom decades ago. Today, she is professor and director of the School of Public Affairs at the University of British Columbia. So, welcome, John and Allison, to the opening session of this conference. Thank you each for being willing to share your insights with us. John, let me turn to you first. And let me ask, you played, as I mentioned, a key role in the US response to the crisis. Tell us a little bit about that response and some of the lessons you think should be taken from it.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's a real pleasure to be here, and a particular pleasure to be sharing a panel slot with my friend and colleague, Allison MacFarlane. I will start, I think, by listing the lessons, and then I'll turn to some aspects of how it actually worked in the Obama administration's efforts to assist Japan in the aftermath of the Fukushima accident. But I think that whole experience underscored the importance of 5 lessons. The first lesson is that it's important for everybody to recognize that a major nuclear accident anywhere can affect the future of nuclear energy everywhere. And that means that every country that can assist should assist, and such assistance should be enabled and welcomed by the country where the accident is taking place. The second important lesson, I think, is that both in the country where the accident is taking place and in the countries offering assistance, it is crucial to have a strong science and technology team in place in government with clear lines of authority established before any crises actually occur. One shouldn't be trying to organize these lines of communication and these domains of responsibility in real time while the accident is happening. Thirdly, in a crisis, communication between the leaders of the science teams and responsible officials have to be quickly established, and they have to be continuously maintained. Fourth, government scientists should have and should use access to the best relevant expertise all across their societies, universities, companies, national labs, non-governmental organizations, the government itself. And fifth, officials and government scientists need to strive to ensure that their public statements are consistent with each other as well as with the best current information. And let me just say, not to take up too much time, that the way the federal government's response in the United States to the Fukushima accident was organized began with a meeting in the White House Situation Room on the afternoon of the accident that assembled all of the key government officials with responsibilities related to response to an accident of that sort, and including the US ambassador to Japan, John Roos, on a video link. And that meeting went on for 6 or 7 hours into the night then took a break and resumed by video link and teleconference for the entire night that followed. And in that effort, lines of responsibility were clarified, the communications with policy officials were set up, and very importantly, the response of the US military in support of the accident in Japan was solidified literally in the first hour, which enabled the US aircraft carrier Ronald Reagan, which was just a few tens of kilometers off the Japanese coast, to serve as a refueling, cleaning haven for the helicopters, the rescue helicopters that would otherwise have had to travel much larger distances.
Thank you very much. Allison, you played a major role coming on as chair a little over a year after the beginning of the crisis in helping determine what the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission would do. Can you tell us some of what you see as the most important things that NRC did, and perhaps some of the things not done or lessons not learned?
Sure, thanks, Matt, and thanks so much for the invitation to be with the two of you. And John, it's great to see you. And thanks for taking me on so many years ago in 1996 when you arrived at Harvard and I arrived at Harvard. And I also want to note that the last time I spoke with you all in this kind of setting, not this kind of setting, but we were actually physically together, and it was really literally a year ago. And that was literally the last trip that I took before we were beset by this awful pandemic. So glad to see everybody still managing through this. Some lessons learned and not learned. And then I can talk about NRC actions as well. But I would say that one lesson, and Matt, you mentioned it already, not just for the regulator. And again, this is a lesson that the US regulator decided not to incorporate, but is a significant lesson, is that dead people isn't the relevant metric for an accident of this type. It's everything else. 160,000 people evacuated. There's still areas that are no-go land and people will never be able to return to, but less than 35% of the people have returned. There's been loss of land, loss of community, loss of jobs, loss of industries, loss of the fishing industry, for instance, and agricultural impacts. The economic costs have been enormous, from decontamination, decommissioning, and compensation alone. TEPCO itself estimates $188 billion. Other estimates put over 40 years and a number closer to $1 trillion. And of course, this doesn't include the electricity impact costs. There were 54 reactors in the country before the accident. 9 are only operating now, only 9 restarted. And 24 of those 54 are permanently shut down. There's a need to constantly update. Is another lesson. A need to constantly update knowledge of natural hazards like earthquakes and flooding. And a lot of regulators took that lesson. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission began to take that lesson. In fact, they required flooding and seismic hazard reevaluations. Unfortunately, 2 years ago, in January 2019, the majority of the then Nuclear Regulatory Commission decided to abandon the flooding and seismic hazard reevaluations. And so they essentially said that it's okay to operate reactors in the United States based on 40-year-old seismic and flooding hazard analysis. As we all know, the climate has been changing, and we need to definitely update the flooding hazard analyses. And by the way, as a geologist, geology has learned a lot in 40 years. And so we have much better understanding of seismic hazards in the US, but nuclear power plants won't be required to update to that. Another lesson, and I'll just mention a couple more, is sometimes you need to manage the fuel cycle, the entire fuel cycle well. We saw this with Fukushima in Unit 4 pool. The capacity was really full. Why was it full? Because they didn't have a long-term functioning plan for dealing with their spent nuclear fuel. And in the end, we need to have a plan for that. And then finally, I'll just say there are sometimes straightforward solutions that aren't necessarily followed. So many countries, as a result of either the Chernobyl accident or the Fukushima accident, decided to add filters to their containment venting systems. So if the containments became overpressured and they had to release gases, those radioactive gases could be filtered. And it's a very simple solution. It's just through a tank of water. So you just add a tank of water to piping from the vent itself to the tank of water. So countries that have done this or are in the process of doing it: Belgium, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Finland, France, Germany, Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Canada, China, South Korea, Japan, not the United States. The staff at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission recommended making such a change, but the commission itself decided not to follow that change.
Thank you so much. Let me ask John, you started right off with the point that an accident anywhere affects nuclear energy everywhere. You're one of the leading voices on the subject of climate change and what we need to do to address it. In the years since the Fukushima Daiichi accident, how have you been thinking about nuclear's potential role in mitigating climate change, and how, if at all, should these accidents affect our thinking about that?
Well, first of all, my view is that it will be considerably easier to master the climate change challenge if we have the help of an increased contribution from nuclear energy. The difficulty is that getting a significantly increased contribution from nuclear energy worldwide will actually require mastering 4 different challenges. The first challenge is that nuclear energy has to be made less expensive. Nuclear power plants today are too costly. In most parts of the world, they are not competitive with other ways to generate electricity, including very significantly not competitive with fossil fuel electricity generation. If we want a big contribution, we have to make them less expensive. At the same time that we're making them less expensive, we need to be sure that we don't make them less safe, and that preferably we make them more safe. That is, that the chances of a large accident are actually decreased in the next generation and future generations of nuclear reactors. The third challenge we have to meet is devising approaches to the management of radioactive waste that are acceptable not only to the technical community, but also to the public. And the fourth challenge, as you very well know, Matt, given your extraordinary history of contributions in this space, we have to do everything possible to break the link between expansion of nuclear weapons capabilities and expansion of nuclear energy capabilities. I believe that all 4 of those challenges can be mastered, but whether we are wise enough and smart enough to do it remains to be seen. In the interests of mastering the climate change challenge, we should certainly be trying to do it, and we should be increasing the investments that we make around the world toward mastering those 4 challenges.
Allison, you've also been a key voice on climate change. How do you see the role of regulators, not only in the United States, but around the world, in mastering the kinds of challenges that John was talking about?
In terms of,
well, how can regulators ensure safety and security and appropriate waste management while allowing the industry to innovate and try to reduce cost and so on. How do we draw that balance?
Yeah, I don't see that that the regulator should be an impediment to the industry. The regulators, has a specific job and mission, and that's to require, safety and security in the case of the U.S. regulator. And I don't think that that's necessarily done and puts an undue burden on industry itself. If you look at the overall costs, and I know that there are folks in industry, especially in the advanced nuclear community, that are claiming that the regulator is the one, in the US situation anyway, that's sorry about the squeaking in the background. I have a puppy, a COVID puppy. So anyway, the regulator isn't the one who is the source of the main costs of developing new plants. It's really it's expensive to develop new nuclear power, and it's expensive because you have to do full-scale testing, or at least seriously large testing, and that's expensive because nuclear power itself is expensive to build these plants. So what the regulator can do is do their job and ensure that these facilities are going to be safe. They have to do their due diligence. As John said, an accident anywhere is an accident everywhere. If you allow a plant that is not safe to go into operation and you have an accident, it will affect everybody everywhere. So that's, just the regulators got to keep their eyes on the prize and the mission.
All right. John, one of the, well, I guess both of you in a way, one of the difficult problems has been to try to balance some level of regulatory stability with responding to what we learn and what advancing knowledge of the hazards, as Allison was describing. And one of the interesting policies at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is what's called the backfit rule, which basically says that the NRC won't impose a new safety requirement if they've already given you a license to operate, unless cost-benefit analysis shows that the benefit to society outweighs the cost of the new safety measure. And I've always felt that that would make sense if you really knew how to estimate the benefits to society, if you really could assess in absolute terms the risk very well. But let me ask you what you think about that approach, and whether there's anything different that we ought to be doing.
Well, Matt, first of all, I agree with you that the state of the art of cost-benefit analysis is not up to the challenge that NRC rule imposes on it. One of the things that we should have learned from our long and challenging experience is that events of low probability but high consequence do occur. And in the typical cost-benefit analysis, emphasis is put on the expectation value of harm, that is, the probability of harm times the consequences if it occurs, without adequate attention to the tails of the distribution. In my view, we need an approach to regulation that understands the disproportionate dangers associated with very high impact events near the tails of the distribution. And we need to make investments in protecting against those events that are out of proportion to what focusing on the mean would justify.
And that is true of climate change as well, as our late colleague Marty Weitzman so forcefully pointed out.
Absolutely.
Allison, do you have thoughts on that question?
You know, I think it's, as you said, Matt, I think it's important and John to focus on this. I think that the regulator has to pay attention to the safety issues, and they do. You know, they're not there to enable the industry. They're there to provide a particular function, which is to keep it safe.
That was a remarkably careful response. Let me begin opening it to questions from the floor, if I might. So there's a question from Rachel Martin about how do we unlink nuclear energy from nuclear weapons development, as John Holdren suggested. John, do you want to take a first cut at that, or either of you?
I'll happily take a first cut and then hope maybe that you'll take a second, Matt, because this is something to which you've devoted an enormous amount of creative attention. But the first thing I would say is that nuclear energy should be advanced for the time being and for certainly the next few decades in a way that does not depend on the recycling of separated plutonium. Separated plutonium is directly bomb-usable material, virtually no matter what its isotopic composition. In a study in which we both participated, Matt, in the 1990s, we concluded that separated plutonium needs to be protected to essentially the same standard that we protect actual nuclear weapons. And that particular condition imposes costs and difficulties on recycling of plutonium that basically make it economically infeasible. We are fortunate that the world has very large supplies of natural uranium in relation to potential demands. There is no actual need to separate plutonium from spent fuel and recycle it on any timescale of practical policy interest. And to me, the centerpiece of the separation of nuclear energy activities from nuclear weapon activities is to avoid the separation of plutonium, and of course also to avoid the use of high enriched uranium. Very few reactor types require high enriched uranium, and since high enriched uranium is also directly usable in nuclear weapons, it should also be avoided in the civil sector.
So for the broader audience, I would say a couple of points and then turn it to Allison to see if she wants to say anything. I think first, having a country have a nuclear power reactor under international inspection, IAEA safeguards, in and of itself doesn't give a country much of a leg up on a nuclear weapons program. It's really the fuel cycle, the management of plutonium, as John mentioned, or the enrichment of uranium that is the key proliferation risk of nuclear energy. And so I think when we think about the potential growth and spread of nuclear energy, we need to think about how to manage the fuel cycle, as Allison was saying, not only for safety reasons, but for non-proliferation reasons. And to most countries that have nuclear power today don't have either enrichment or reprocessing on their soil. And I think we ought to work on creating incentives that keep that true. After all, every country has a right to build large civilian commercial aircraft, and only a few countries find it profitable for themselves to do so rather than buying them from other countries. And I think probably that we may be able to manage that the same will be true of the nuclear fuel cycle. I do think some of the advanced systems, we'll hear toward the end of the conference about sort of, nuclear battery systems where nothing is done at all with the fuel on site and so on, may have conceivably, depending on how they're implemented and so on, even lower proliferation risks than some of today's reactors. But Allison, what are your thoughts on this linkage?
I think you guys have covered a lot of good territory there. So I'm going to go on the other side of things and say that I think there's some ways in which you could say that the only way for nuclear energy to be delinked from nuclear weapons is to devalue nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons need to be really devalued, and we need to eliminate them. And if nuclear weapons were eliminated entirely, it would make the world a lot safer for nuclear power in terms of the link to proliferation. So nuclear weapons need to be devalued, and they need to be devalued by the nuclear weapons states.
Those are terrific points. I want to subscribe to them as well. I have been arguing for many, many years, in fact, many decades, that devaluing the currency of nuclear weapons in international affairs is the starting point for a sensible set of policies. But I also want to endorse Matt Bunn's point that advanced technologies may ultimately offer significant advantages in respect to proliferation and also in respect to safety and cost. And my view is that, again, given the value of having an increased contribution from nuclear energy, if it could be done safely and with minimal links to proliferation, we should be making investments to determine whether any of these advanced concepts will in fact bring big benefits across the range of challenges that nuclear energy faces.
So Ed Lyman asks, building off of the point that Allison made about how deaths is not the only appropriate metric, how do we respond to the argument made by advocates of nuclear energy that it results in the lowest number of apparent deaths per kilowatt hour of the various energy sources?
I would just say that that's just the wrong metric. So what that it, by your account, that it results in fewer deaths. If you have an accident that removes 160,000 people from their homes, and this is the really best scenario. You have to realize with the Fukushima accident, they got really lucky because the prevailing winds blew most of the radiation into the ocean, and the winds turned around for only a short period. So there was only a short period of time when some of that radiation was contaminating the land. Even so, 160,000 people had to move. Even so, most of the nuclear reactors in the country are still shut down 10 years later. Even so, in the summers in government buildings, because of the constraint of electrical supply, buildings were set at 84 degrees. So that those, they're serious impacts that don't have anything to do with the numbers of dead people. So the answer is, or sort of, so what? What about all these other impacts?
I would add to that the assessment of risk in society has long been plagued by excessive attention to the phenomena that are easiest to count. In fact, it's been described as preoccupation with what's countable as opposed to what counts. And again, first of all, the actual uncertainties in estimating ultimate deaths through all of the pathways by which human health and well-being are influenced by large extreme accidents make it highly questionable that any one single point estimate is actually a valid guide to action. And the second point is that the biggest potential impacts on life and health, as well as on many other things, do occur in those tails of the distribution. For example, if it turned out that the spread of nuclear energy led to the spread of nuclear weapons in ways that ultimately resulted in a nuclear war, what do you count then as the death that resulted from nuclear energy?
Exactly.
I'm reminded decades ago, in Europe, they did a huge study on the externalities of different energy sources. And nuclear came out quite well in that study. And if you look at, this was called externee at the time. And if you look, they included a number of 0 for the cost of the external cost of nuclear accidents. And the reason was that they, didn't know what the number was. And so they picked literally the only number that we know for sure is not true. But probably, very large numbers we would know for sure are not true also. But I thought that was remarkable. All right, Melissa Schambach asks, how can nuclear energy be depoliticized in the United States? I know for sure I don't have an answer to that question.
I think it's hard to depoliticize anything right now in the United States. It's, and this isn't necessarily a Trump effect. This has been going on for a number of years, certainly since the mid 1990s, but everything has become politicized. So
let me make one short comment about this. First of all, I think polls show that support for the use of nuclear energy for electricity generation has gone up since the climate change issue became a prominent focus of national discussion and debate. And I'm not sure that the real problem at the moment is public acceptance. I think the real problems are, first of all, above all cost. Secondly, attending to public concerns by addressing safety and radioactive waste management and proliferation linkages more effectively.
yeah, no, John, you're absolutely right. It's really the real issue facing nuclear power and any future of nuclear power in the United States, and actually largely the world, even China, is cost. It is very expensive to do. And the competitors are becoming cheaper and cheaper all the time. And so I don't know how that problem is solved, and you really do need to pay attention to safety.
I will make one more point on this, which is that the cost disadvantage of nuclear energy can be reduced in 2 ways. One is innovation in nuclear technologies that make it less expensive while at the same time making it safer. But the other is to put a price on the carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels. We should have a substantial price on carbon emissions. If we did, the gap between the cost of nuclear energy and the cost of fossil fuels would shrink. And we could end up with a world in which most of the electricity is provided by a combination of the intermittent renewables, wind and solar photovoltaics, and some nuclear. But that is particularly unlikely to happen in the absence of a significant price on carbon emissions.
Yes, totally agreed.
I should also say that in terms of actual policy in the United States, while a number of Republican advocates of nuclear energy criticized the Obama administration for failing to support nuclear energy, that was just not correct. The Obama administration took quite a number of initiatives in support of nuclear energy, as had the Bush administration before it, and as did the Trump administration. And so there is actually, in terms of actual policy, a fairly bipartisan support for at least exploring the nuclear energy option. Mark Hibbs poses an interesting question. He says, what did the Fukushima accident in particular tell us about the balance and the relationship between the regulator and the broader government, and between the operator and the industry, and the regulator and the industry in response to a major accident?
So thanks, Mark, for that question. And this is a point that I would have made initially, but felt I was going on too long. But I think one of the most important lessons to come out of Fukushima is the importance of an independent regulator. A number of Japanese analyses, including a diet analysis of the accident, said that there was collusion among the regulator, government, and industry that was part of the root cause of the accident. And so you need a regulator that is independent of the industry, that is independent from political influence, but that has the backing of the government and has adequate both financial and human resources to do their job, and can actually have the ability to shut down plants if they see that something unsafe is happening. And all countries struggle with this, including the United States, having a regulator that is adequately independent enough from industry and government. But it is something that they must all continue to struggle to do as well as possible.
I think that's an important point, and one that applies not just in the nuclear industry, but in many industries where,
yes,
the reality is the biggest technical expertise in how an industry is actually working is often in that industry. And so regulators end up often drawing their personnel from the industry, getting a lot of their information from the industry, relying very heavily on the industry for their perception of what's going on.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Matt. And it's hard, but that's the way that you ensure the most safety, is to have the most distance.
Right. And one of the things that's fortunate in the United States is that the NRC is able to draw not only on the industry, but on the national labs who are independent.
The NRC, the United States, is very fortunate because it has a nuclear navy. And the nuclear navy often is the backbone of the NRC. Folks leave the Navy and they come to the NRC.
And also the backbone of the industry self-regulating group, the Institute for Nuclear Power Operations.
That's correct.
All right, so along that line, Naj Meshkati asks about a statement you made, Allison, years ago about the importance of safety culture, and asks if you could elaborate on the safety culture issue.
Yeah, and another issue that affects not just the nuclear industry, but all regulated industries. Its safety culture is absolutely essential. The workers at plants must be able to raise issues to their management without fear of retaliation if they see something going wrong. They must be able to speak up, and management has to be accountable. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, to its great credit, regulates safety culture at nuclear facilities in the US, and it's important.
So how does the NRC assess how safety culture is going at a particular plant? It's always, it's in the security world, it's easy to assess, is the fence as high as it was supposed to be? Is the lock of the type that it's supposed to be? But assessing the culture is
Right.
A trickier problem.
Well, one way is by the NRC takes allegations of potential wrongdoing or issues at nuclear facilities from workers. So a worker could sort of drop a dime. That's an anachronistic phrase on the nuclear power plant that they work for, and the NRC is obliged to follow up any allegation that they get. And so that's one way of looking at it. And then they will follow up with an inspection where they will go and interview staff and management and that kind of thing.
So Aditi Verma asks a question about whether quantitative risk assessment approaches by themselves are sufficient, or whether they should be supplemented with qualitative methodologies, which the NRC staff was developing for a while, but then that work was ultimately discontinued.
I don't know what she means by the qualitative methodologies that the NRC staff was developing, but I would say obviously quantitative measures aren't enough, and it's difficult to do more qualitative work, but it's absolutely necessary. And I think we talked about that earlier with John, that you just, you don't want to just count what you can easily see to count. You need to go deeper than that. That's your job.
So I am fond of a quote that is often attributed to Einstein, but nobody that I know can find it in Einstein's writings, which is not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. Similar to what John was saying
Right.
earlier. All right. So there's another question about what should be done with spent fuel and nuclear waste. Should we have long-term centralized surface storage? Should we, is there any hope for moving forward on a repository in the United States? Should we think about an international repository? What's your current thinking on that? I know you've written on that extensively, Allison.
No, we should not think about an international repository unless we want to wait hundreds of years. Yes, there is hope in the United States. And what we need to do is have a deep mined geologic repository. That's number one. The Blue Ribbon Commission had an excellent set of recommendations for the United States. We need to just go back to those. We need a consent-based process to find a site. Nevada has been extremely consistent for over 35 years saying they do not want the waste. Okay, I think that's good. We tell our kids that, if you want something, you can't just tell us that you want something and then, we'll get it for you. You have to want it for a while. Well, 35 years is enough time for wanting to not have
nuclear waste.
But because the United States has the only operating deep geologic facility for nuclear waste, not high-level nuclear waste, but transuranic waste, the WIPP facility in southeastern New Mexico, I have hope that the United States can find a solution for the high-level waste as well.
All right. All right, Stefano Terlizzi has a question. What is your view about micro reactors? Do you think some of the proposed designs address the challenges highlighted by Dr. Holdren?
I'd like to hear John on this one.
Well, first of all, there is currently a proliferation of ideas about how to make reactors more compact and more economical at the same time. That is an enormous challenge because in part of the economies of scale, which have characterized nuclear energy up to date, meaning that the cost per kilowatt hour has tended to be lower in large reactors than in small ones. In principle, it's possible to overcome that obstacle if we could come up with reactor designs that could be mass produced of modest size rather than built on almost a unique one at a time construction on site, which has been the pattern. We might be able to make progress there. I have not spent a lot of time examining the range of specific proposals that are out there for compact reactors. My understanding is that there are some that have some promise, and we ought to investigate those further and develop them to the point where we can really make a judgment about whether they offer significant advantages. But I remain agnostic on whether that will ultimately be the successful approach to making nuclear energy both less expensive and safer, but it might be. And that line of development is certainly worth continuing to pursue.
All right, we are running short of time, but let me pose a question from Nick Roth, who says there's a growing perception that the United States needs to be more competitive with Russia and China in exporting nuclear reactors. Is there a way for the United States to compete and cooperate with Russia and China at the same time, or does it have to be a zero-sum game?
I will leap in on that and say it does not have to be a zero-sum game, but I would start by saying we don't need to compete unless we have something that is worth putting into the competition. The idea that we have to compete for its own sake, even if we don't have an attractive technology to compete with, I think is sloppy thinking, and that we should be focusing, first of all, on making sure we have something to compete with. But secondly, the domains of cooperation related, for example, to nuclear safety, to nuclear waste management, to non-proliferation, all of these are basically public goods in which it is in the mutual interest of all of the countries involved to work together. I don't think we have a lot of trouble distinguishing between those things that are inherently competitive and those things that are inherently public goods where we should work together.
All right, well, we have reached the end of our time. I want to thank both of you very much for offering your time and your insights for this opening panel of our conference. And I want to apologize to those members of the audience who posed questions that we didn't have time to get to. So if the audience would join me in thanking John and Allison.
Thank you. That's good.
And thank you all. And thanks to you for your masterful moderation.
Thanks, Matt.
All right. We are now going to turn to our second panel. This panel will be moderated by Chris Russell. So I want to turn the conversation over to Chris. Russell is an award-winning journalist who has served as president of the Council for the Advancement of Science Writing and the National Association of Science Writers. She is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. As a young woman, she reported on the scene on the 3 Mile Island accident for the Washington Star. Today, she is a senior fellow at the Belfer Center's Environment and Natural Resources Program and teaches a long-running course on energy and the media here at the Harvard Kennedy School. So, Chris, let me turn the conversation over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our audience spread out all over the world. As Matt said, I'm Chris Russell, a science journalist and senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School Environment and Natural Resources Program. And it's my great pleasure to moderate this first panel of this great 3-day Managing the Atom conference. We're going to take a very broad look at the reverberating impacts of the Chernobyl and Fukushima accidents. In a way, it's very hard to believe that it's been a decade since the March 11th, 2011 Fukushima nuclear accident in Japan following a major earthquake and tsunami, and 35 years since the April 26, 1986 Chernobyl disaster in the Ukraine, the most severe in the history of nuclear power. And as Matt mentioned, there was a partial meltdown in 3 Mile Island, Pennsylvania, in the US in 1979 that had a great impact on the public attitudes toward nuclear energy in the United States. So where are we today? We have 440 operable power plants in the world providing 10% of global energy. 55 reactors under construction, 109 planned, and 329 more reactors proposed, with China, India, and Russia leading the way. Fortunately, today we have a great panel of distinguished speakers from around the world to give us perspectives on what has happened over the last decade and the last 35 years. First, we have Ostap Samarak. He is a former Minister of Ecology and Natural Resources in the Ukraine and has served in numerous other Ukrainian government posts. He is a former People's Deputy of Ukraine's Parliament and a former Minister of the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine. Samarak is currently a member of the People's Front, a Ukrainian political party founded in 2014. Next, we have Kiyoshi Kurakawa. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of Tokyo and the former chairman of the Fukushima Nuclear Accident Independent Investigation Commission of Japan. Professor Kurakawa is a former president of the Science Council of Japan and a science advisor to the Prime Minister of Japan, 2006 to 2008. He received the 2012 Scientific Freedom and Responsibility Award from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Third, Daniel Poneman, President and CEO of Centrus Energy Corporation, a supplier of nuclear fuel and services to the nuclear power industry. From 2009 to 2014, Mr. Poneman was the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Energy. His responsibilities spanned U.S. energy policies and programs, hydrocarbons, renewables, and nuclear, and included cybersecurity, national security, and international cooperation. He also oversaw the department's emergency response efforts ranging from Fukushima to Hurricane Sandy in this country. And our last speaker is Sheila Jasanoff, the Pforzheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at Harvard Kennedy School. A pioneer in her field, her work explores the role of science and technology in the law, politics, and policy of modern democracies. She's authored more than 130 articles and chapters and is author or editor of more than 15 books. She founded and directs the STS program at Harvard University. So we're going to start with some opening questions and different questions posed to each of our speakers, starting with Minister Samarak of the Ukraine. And Minister, over the past 35 years since the Chernobyl accident, what have been the most important or significant long-term implications of the accident, environmentally, economically, socially, or politically? And what consequences continue to present a challenge?
Good morning, US, and good afternoon, Europe and Asia. That is my best wishes from Kyiv, from Ukraine. That is actually only 100 kilometers from Chernobyl nuclear station. And I hope that all participants are healthy, secure, and safe. And actually, that is very important in a time when the world is fighting with a new global secure challenge, I mean COVID-19. So thank you for opportunity to talk and to participate today in this conference. And I see that this conference should move us together forward in building new, safe, and secure nuclear policy over the world. And that is extremely important to talk directly with Ukraine. There are a number of reasons, but I will mention a few of them. First of all, we have a great experience in overcoming and of overcoming the results of the nuclear disaster in Chernobyl nuclear station. And actually we are ready to share all our knowledges, all our experience with our partners, and we are ready as well to provide common researches, and we are doing this with the Fukushima, for example, university, and with our partners from Japan, and we have good relations in working together in the researches, different researches. Secondly, of course, Ukraine has its own nuclear generation, and my country has ambitions to develop it in a cooperation with our strategic partners, as for example US is, and the development and the future of the nuclear electricity generation is extremely important now when we are talking about climate changes and about eliminating of the fossil fuel generation. And I do see in this the future of world cooperation, and that is very important to talk directly. And last but not the least reason is that in a time of Russian hybrid aggression, direct communications are necessary to protect nuclear safety and security in the world. And we have to remember that Russia is not only trying to be aggressive in Ukraine, but Russia is a nuclear weapon state, and with the all reasons that can be from that. Talking about implications of the nuclear disaster, we have to talk about strategy and policy. And now Ukraine is ready to manage all consequences of that disaster, but looking in a history 35 years ago, I have to mention that Ukraine, actually that was Soviet Union, we were not ready to manage this disaster. And answering your question about politically implications, I want to remind all of us that that was the mistake of the communist regime, of the Communist Party. Actually, that were 1986, 3 years before the fall of the Berlin's Wall and the end of the Cold War, when communist regime were keeping silence weeks after the disaster. And actually that was the great shock for the world, and actually that was the start of the end of the communist regime in Ukraine. And actually that is a very deep result of, in a political sense, of that. I want to mention another political dimension that was very important for me when I was serving as a minister in 2016-2019. My idea was that we have to do all processes that are in a Chernobyl zone absolutely open, absolutely visible. And you can see the word behind me, Chernobyl, is a territory of the change. So my idea was to show our society and to show the world that we are absolutely transparent, that we are absolutely predictable, and we are sustainable. And we accelerated all our work to do with our spent fuel storages, with new confinement, to finish its construction, to build another facilities. And that was a period of the Revolution of Dignity when Ukraine accelerated all these processes, and we were successful. And on our during our meetings, this annual meetings on a donor conferences provided by European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and J7, we were in a good light, I will say, and that was very important for us because we not only did our homework, but we allocated enough money for the future operation of all of these facilities. And as I mentioned about the openness of this territory, I proposed a new vision of visiting these territories. And my idea was it should be a controlled visit, but any person from Ukraine abroad should be able to come there and to see what is the greatest disaster, and what is the threats, and what was to be done, and what is the nuclear safety and security. And you can imagine that in 1916, the annual number of visitors were 8,000 people. During 3 years, the number of these visitors were increased up to 120,000 people. 80% of those people were foreigners and 20% Ukrainians. And I think that was great deal to increase the world culture, and understanding what is the nuclear safety is, and what is importance for each society and for the world in this. Talking about other implications, of course, social was very important, but I want to focus on economical and environmental. Definitely, environmental implication of the Chernobyl accident, we will feel for 100 years, maybe for 1,000 years, and that is absolutely understandable. But that was a surprise for me and for my colleagues, and maybe it will be a surprise for you, that 30 years after disaster, when this territory was closed for people's activity, we saw the great development, rebirth of wild nature. That's why 30 years after disaster, we created the reserve territories, and now we have good cooperation with European universities and research centers to discover, to research how wild nature behavior after such disaster, and without presenting the human mankind. And that is very interesting, I guess, for all of us in the future. Talking about economically, of course, that is too expensive thing. I mean, disaster and all that was after. And thanks to the solidarity of the world, Ukraine was supported, and now we have all facilities, working facilities for eliminating the nuclear disaster. And we have a program, state program, financed by Ukrainian government to overcome, to have absolutely safe ecological territory in a very, very close future. And we are working together with our partners from EBRD, from J7, especially with French and American companies. And that is an example of the good world solidarity and world cooperation. And talking about economical future of that territory, I have to mention that my policy that I was providing during my work in the cabinet was focused on building their new industry, actually an industry of nuclear waste management. And that is very, very prospective in the future. And we understand that the future of nuclear energy will be the future of new technologies, but even new technologies means that nuclear waste industry should be developed. This industry should be maximum safe, maximum secure, and we have a great experience in that, and we are eager to have cooperation with our partners from other countries. And I think that that is one of the points how to change this heavy economically future in a Chernobyl and in Chernobyl zone. And
thank you. Thank you so much. We've got a big panel, so we're going to move on to Professor Kurokawa. As the leader of the parliamentary inquiry on the Fukushima accident, what do you see as the greatest impacts of that accident on Japan and on other countries, and the most crucial lesson from your inquiry? Professor Kurokawa.
Now, do you hear me now?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. Just brief, I think this is a 10th year of Fukushima, historical disaster. And I think that was triggered by tsunami and earthquake, which is facing, that area is faced with tectonic plates. So very well known for tsunami. But at least that happened about a few weeks ago, again, a big tsunami, and not much tsunami, but earthquake, the same tectonic plates. But anyway, when that happens, in fact, I start communicating. I'm a medical doctor, no background nuclear, but this is a disaster. Whatever the Japanese government make a statement and message, I think following this tweet at that time, it's quite different from, for example, message from US and elsewhere. So I start talking to Ambassador Roos at that time. And when Dr. John Holdren visited Japan at that time, I went to see Ambassador Roos to brief him briefly. And so that was my background. The reason I did that was I spent 14 years of my career in academic medical doctor. I spent in the United States, 14 years. So I know more or less sort of that domain of experts. But anyway, so I pushed Japanese government make an independent commission, more of international membership. But finally, I think Parliament and agreed to create such an institution, independent commission, and invited 10 people, and I was asked to chair it. But I was really pushing international, so that principle of that commission is always completely open to the public and open online, so everybody can see it in the world, and also with simultaneous translation in English. So I think we like to share everything with what we do. And that transparency is a foundation of trust, in my view, in this hyper-connected time. So that even we invited 3 Ukrainian experts, previous speaker was one of them, I'm not so sure, but also we had that thing, you can even right now review this every meeting online with English simultaneous translation. So Nuclear Accident Independent Investigation Commission, NID, Nuclear Accident, NAIC, Nuclear Accident Independent Investigation. That is a sort of acronym. So you type it and you can see it. Even that name is my name and Fukushima, and you can get all the report. You can more likely to hit this NAIC report, everything. You can see every meeting and the result and everything, because I thought transparency with English translation at the same time was a key to share what we do with the rest of the world. And you can still see that anytime. Now, since then we discovered the foundation, a fundamental issue of nuclear energy in Japan was end up with a collusion, kind of collusion with industry and government and political arm and some part of the academics too. So we discovered, we searched for some economic sort of phrasing or wording for that kind of thing, is found out regulatory capture, which is a concept, economic concept by well known for few centuries, but this concept was advanced by George Stigler, the economic professor at the University of Chicago, and he received a Nobel Economic Prize because he really advanced the concept of this regulatory capture, which means government and also sort of government and corporate, sometimes the government fail to prioritize to protect these people, and rather than that, they just sort of made some decision to, let's say, nuclear energy company or whatever it is. So putting not the people first, but sort of economy first. So this is a reasonably well-known economic phrasing, regulatory capture. So I think the emphasis was this was really typical regulatory capture or the failure of the government to protect their own people. So I think, so if you are more interested in, you can come to that website, you can read the entire text and also every commission meeting with English translation. So I think that is a message we really like to convey and like to share the lessons with the rest of the world. Now, to what extent Japan's sort of system or policy has changed, I am not so sure, although they are doing much better job, there's no question. Because with this internet era, it's very hard to hide certain things eventually, so that in this hyper-connected global world, we insist transparency is a foundation of trust, either corporate or government or academics or whatever the area is. So I think this is a foundation. This has to be a sort of principle of a commission. Since our results revealed this is a sort of kind of collusion or regulatory capture by the government and corporate, so that it's very hard to sort of drastically change the system, even we deliver this paper to the government. Because there's so many stakeholders and transparency become much, much better, and regulatory sort of element of Japanese nuclear become more stringent, more restrictive, very clear, because I think transparency will be more public push, so that I'm sure it's getting better. But remember, in that eastern coast of Japan is very close to this tectonic plate and reasonably well known for the history of repeated tsunami and earthquake. So that's
Thank you so much, Professor Kurakawa. Transparency is definitely the word of the day, and I think that will come up several times. We're going to now turn to the U.S. and Deputy Secretary Poneman to talk about how did the U.S. government and nuclear industry respond to the Fukushima accident, both in real time and some of the follow-up response and lessons learned. Deputy Secretary Poneman.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. First of all, thank you, Chris, for hosting this excellent panel. Thanks to Matt Bunn and the Managing the Atom Project. It's an incredibly important anniversary. I remember March 11th, 2011, like it was yesterday. It was, I was out to dinner with my family, and the response to your question was instantaneous. I immediately got on the phone with Deputy Secretary of State Jim Steinberg, who was receiving separate reports. I believe in the very early hours I was talking to Dr. Holdren, who was the President's science advisor, and all of us swung immediately into action. And to the professor's recent point about the connections that happened to exist already between longtime colleagues, but for the longstanding relationships that many of us already had with counterparts, and I'm remembering particularly Professor Shunsuke Kondo, the head of the JAEC, Japan Atomic Energy Commission at that time. We called, we emailed, and everyone immediately said, we as Americans must do anything and everything we can to support our friends in Japan. No questions were asked. Nobody looked at how much budget authority was available. This was an instant and full-blown crisis. I have had a good experience working in government. I've never seen such an all-of-government approach mustered so quickly. I believe we had daily meetings. They were typically chaired by either the National Security Advisor, Tom Donnellan, I believe it was at the time, or his deputy, Dennis McDonough. And there would be 25 or 30 participants in a very early version of a call like this. It was so exotic for us to see 25 or 30 little mini screens, NRC, all of the military commands, the Environmental Protection Agency, the national laboratories, the Center for Disease Control, not just the usual national security team, but the whole of government. And we mustered a 24-hour response. We sent 17,000 pounds of equipment. We sent aerial measuring instrumentation to measure the early assessment of the contamination on the ground. We logged over 500 flight hours from the US Air Force. We took thousands of field and soil samples. We sent over 34 experts. NRC sent a team. We used modeling from the national laboratories to measure the plume. And it was really, truly an impressive performance. The longer term effect on this was really institutionalized. In April 2012, President Barack Obama and then Prime Minister Noda got together and they established a bilateral commission that sought to take the existing cooperation between Japan and the United States in things nuclear, which had two elements, which at that time were non-proliferation, very important, and peaceful nuclear cooperation, but added to it three new elements. That's emergency response, safety, and environmental management. And they elevated the dialogue to a deputy minister level, deputy secretary in the United States. And so I had the honor to co-chair that initially with Deputy Minister Beisho and then with Deputy Minister Sugiyama. And that was also a whole of government approach. We had deep conversations. We tried to get very practical. We brought in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I was very gratified to see that notwithstanding political changes in the United States, that tradition has carried on. I know my successor, Professor Liz Sherwood-Randall, and then Deputy Secretary at that time, she carried it on. It carried on under Deputy Secretary Dan Briette as well. The lessons learned were all the lessons you've heard from your other colleagues. The need for transparency, the need for communication, and it was for us an inspiring episode to see, frankly, the courage of the Japanese people in confronting this challenge, but it really highlighted the necessary elements of transparency and cooperation. And I would note, it was not only a whole of government approach in the United States, it was a whole of government approach in Japan. And indeed, we reached out to the leaders of the nuclear programs in other very important International Atomic Energy Agency member agencies. So that was the experience that we had, and it continues to inspire us. And we realize, I guess the last point I would make is that as we look today at the climate crisis that we face and the increasing pressure that all of us on the planet face to get to net zero emissions, and when you look at the analyses of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the International Energy Agency, and you see that without a significant expansion of nuclear, we will not come close to achieving either 2 degrees, much less 1.5 degrees centigrade target. And then, Chris, when you put that with your laydown at the beginning of how many reactors are operating around the world and how many more are planned, it really underlines that we should leverage the lessons learned out of Fukushima on this very important 10th anniversary to make sure that we don't just dwell on the past, but that we make sure that we are braced for the future with very rigorous regulatory processes, which we avoid regulatory capture, transparency, and cooperation, because otherwise our planet is in big trouble. And I think all of us on this call are deeply committed to seeing the climate challenge addressed effectively, and an effective nuclear industry with safe and secure performance is absolutely essential to that good result. So thanks again for hosting.
Thank you so much. And finally, we'll hear from Professor Jasanoff. Professor, what do you see as the most crucial issues for the governance of risk raised by these nuclear accidents, and what issues need to be understood better or viewed differently?
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to all the organizers for inviting me to be on this panel. It's a little bit daunting to be accompanying these 3 co-panelists with the depth of their involvement and their understanding of the on-the-ground situations in their respective countries. I am merely an academic. My closest exposure to the events that we're talking about is that I did pay a visit to Fukushima a couple of years ago and saw what was going on site. And I hope that we can talk about that a little bit later on down the line. On the other hand, I have an advantage, which perhaps the actors in the situation don't have, which is that I've been observing nuclear energy as one of the major sites for the development of academic and professional thinking about risk analysis. You can think about risk analysis as almost having been born together with nuclear energy, and many of the things that we understand today about the limitations of our understanding of risk developed through experiences gained in the interaction between analysts and people who design and deploy nuclear energy. So I've had the advantage of hearing some people who are not active anymore and who may not even be with us here anymore. I remember, for instance, in the years that I was at Cornell, Henry Kendall came to give a talk there, a co-founder of the Union of Concerned Scientists and a major figure in physics and in nuclear energy design. And he said that civilian nuclear power had not borrowed a lesson from civilian aviation, which was every time that there was a problem, there was an exceedingly detailed investigation into exactly what had happened and a determination that those kinds of accidents would be stamped out. And he specifically cited, and I remember this, that the accidents involving nuclear reactors were very different in the military in the US from what they were in the civilian sector. And this is minor accidents and major accidents. And since then, I've had innumerable conversations with nuclear engineers, which suggests that indeed there is a double standard going on between civilian and military. So that is a thing worth keeping in mind, that nuclear power is not nuclear power, is not nuclear power, that the institutional context in which it is embedded makes a big difference. I also remember a talk by Richard Garwin here at Harvard, in which he talked for 45 minutes about how nuclear energy design had changed and how much safer it was. And at the very end, he said, I see only 2 problems left. One is the worry that there will be military appropriation of parts of the fuel cycle and that nuclear materials will be used in military development, and the other is waste management. So in that one sentence at the end of a long talk, he pointed the finger at 2 of the ongoing problems that I think we still have not solved. I do a lot of comparative work, And it's worth noting that the countries in which nuclear energy development is being pursued are the countries in which being a member of the nuclear club is considered an extremely important sign of nationhood. So these countries include South Korea, they include India, and therefore in those countries, the attempt that we have made in the US to separate out civilian nuclear power from military uses of nuclear power, that division doesn't exist at the highest levels of government. So one may wonder, this is a point worth talking about, when we're talking about transparency, everybody's very eager to discuss the transparency in the corporate sector and the transparency after accidents. But what about transparency as it relates to the division between civilian and military uses? Where does transparency stop with regard to a technology that has this dual use potential and therefore crosses these boundaries? And I think that the question of transparency is not all that simple to address. There is a lot of research in the UK, for instance, suggesting that some of the enthusiasm for nuclear in Whitehall is deeply connected to military purposes. There's a very severe limit to transparency as soon as you get up against that military uses wall. And then, not least, the waste management scene. It's worth remembering that some people think Yucca Mountain is the most expensive piece of real estate in the United States of America. Now, when you start thinking about why that should be so, it's because of the dollars that have been poured into studying this site, but forgetting about whether it's safe or not. Why have we poured all this money into studying this site? It does stand as a symbolic articulation of the fact that we have not solved this waste disposal problem. And I am a lawyer, and I know about the administrative law decisions in which it has been agreed that the government should have the discretion to conduct the risk assessment of the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle as it will, but the public does not accept necessarily that judgment that the courts have issued. So it's well to remember today, in the wake of an administration that has left facts and truth in tatters to some extent, that what people trust and believe is not assertions of facts, but the institutions that produce those facts. And regulatory capture may be one thing, military purposes may be a different thing, but what we're talking about is restoring trust in the institutions that manage nuclear energy. And I think that, well, I'm looking forward to hearing what my colleagues on this panel have to say about it. But in a period of vaccine hesitancy, for instance, I don't see that the American public is rising up to believe the institutions that provide facts, even facts geared to saving their lives, let alone possibly endangering them. So with that, let me hand it back to you, Chris.
Thank you so much. In fact, talking about transparency, we have alluded to, but not discussed directly, public acceptance of nuclear power around the world. And certainly these accidents, both at the time and their lingering consequences, increased fear of nuclear power and have slowed the growth of new nuclear power. And I'm wondering how this differs around the world, and perhaps going back to you, Professor Jasanoff, well, what is your sense of the public acceptance of nuclear power, and how, if any way, that you might suggest that the industry and the governments can increase the acceptance with combining that with the transparency that you've all talked about?
Thanks, Chris. I mean, just very quickly, there isn't a single global public, and the acceptance differs hugely country by country. So I don't see Germany, for instance, being eager to embrace nuclear power. The way they have chosen is renewables, wind and solar, wind in particular. And I doubt that there's anything that can be done in the near future to persuade Germans that their country or the world are prepared to take on the entire management of the nuclear energy cycle. And it's the cycle we're talking about, not just the power plant. In India, there is a lot of opposition, but by and large, because of the close government management of India's identity as a nuclear force, that opposition does not express itself. And one might ask, you know, on a day when one of the news stories is about how India has been downgraded from being a free country to only a partially free country, one may ask whether it's good for democracy that India should be able to stamp out that dissent on nuclear power. In the US, the opposition continues, and even if people persuade people like us that power plants are safe, I doubt that many communities would be eager to embrace the new nuclear reactor being built there. So I think one has to differentiate publics, and I am not embracing the idea of transparency at all, because I think transparency suggests something about the character of institutions that we actually don't have in our world. That is, it's all very well to talk about the word, but its institutional practices are far from being the practices that we actually employ and adopt in managing this particular form of energy.
Might I just comment on that, Chris? I agree with Professor Jasanoff that it's a differentiated response. However, I do see, and this is a world I live in every day, there has been a significant change in public attitudes surrounding nuclear. I think all of us are reading Bill Gates' book. Look, we're in like big trouble, right? The IPCC report, the 1.5 degree report, said that if we hit 2 degrees centigrade, we will lose 99% of the world's coral reefs by 2050. They're gone. 1.5 degrees, we might save 20% of them. 1 billion people rely on those for their livelihoods, apart from just the collapse of an utter ecosystem, right? So I'm reminded of the Mark Twain story about the cat who sat on a hot stove, learned never to sit on a hot stove, but also never sat on a cold stove either. And I think we're at grave risk of overlearning lessons, right? 1,100 Germans die every single year because of the coal-fired plants that have fired up because they shut down the nuclear power plants. So that's 11,000 dead people, right? So obviously we're talking about the need to address the risks and the critical risks, but there are new and exciting technologies. The whole 4th generation of nuclear reactors, including the one that Bill Gates' company has sponsored, but many others beside, and they do, to be sure, have to deal with all these issues of transparency and maintaining and sustaining and improving public confidence. But we have, to my mind, we have to keep our eye on the ball, and the ball is we have to kill carbon. Got to decarbonize the economy. We're not going to make zero by 2035 in the United States without doing everything we can. That's all the wind, all the solar, all the efficiency, and yes, all the nuclear. And I guess I would also say, and I think they're very good points that the professor raised in terms of concerns about waste and proliferation. On the waste side, I had the benefit of hearing Allison MacFarlane earlier. I think she's absolutely right. We need that geologic disposal, but the way to get there is what her Blue Ribbon Commission recommended, which is a consent-based process, which has worked quite well in places like Finland and Sweden. And on non-proliferation, you know, while President Kennedy predicted that there'd be 25 nuclear weapon states by 1970, in fact, we've got 9. And in fact, you know, South Africa, Argentina, Brazil, Libya, countries have walked back from the brink. I think the indication of the vast majority of countries that are interested in nuclear energy are actually interested in nuclear energy. And the International Atomic Energy Agency, and I'm glad you'll be hearing from Director General Grossi shortly, is deeply dedicated to the mission of preventing the diversion to improper uses. And I think that has to remain a completely vigilant aspect of our efforts. But I do worry about kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater if we don't sort of distinguish among some of these factors.
Well, I'm wondering, Professor Kurakawa, what you could say to the general public about how much safer nuclear energy is today, 10 years after Fukushima, and whether or not safety obviously is relative, but does that differ regionally? Do you feel that the lessons of Fukushima have been adopted in nuclear power operations around the world, or what are your concerns at this point?
Well, I suppose so. Perhaps each country and each unit, I'm sure they reinforce or at least reinvestigate and reinforce the rules provided by IAEA, at least. At least in our investigation, IAEA people knew Japanese sort of nuclear was not really completely abiding their recommendations. So that kind of thing, once it's revealed, then you tend to lose the trust of the public. So whenever the transparency is a very important time of this global and hyper-connected world, this is the foundation of trust anyway. If something happens, you lose a big chunk of trust. That's my view.
Well, in your own country, there have been shutdown of most of the nuclear plants. Do you see nuclear power coming back as a major portion of energy in Japan?
Yeah, right. I hope so. And I think it's going to be that direction. There's no question about that sort of global warming. But I think once you lose the trust, I mean, that is very difficult to persuade the greater public. That's my argument.
Well,
So yeah, right. Sorry, that is the reason. In this global world, nuclear is a very important element of energy. So that why don't make this energy as a beyond national boundary? So like maybe I'm suggesting exchange of all the sort of regulators and operators. When I visited this Chattanooga, Tennessee, or the training center, I think I would like to have more exchange of these operators and this and that and training. So if something happened, they know, all the operator and regulator know each other with the first name.
Could we also hear from Mr. Samarak? In your country, 50% of the electricity is coming from nuclear today, so it has been widely endorsed. How much public acceptance and what safety measures have been adopted that give any public confidence that there won't be another Chernobyl?
Right, 50, even more, a little bit more than 50% just now. And you have to know that we managed, or we have 15 nuclear generation, operating nuclear generation stations, not stations, but the blocks, 15 blocks in Ukraine. We have state program for development of our energy supply, and in this program till 2035, we have strategy to build our energy supply from the mix of the renewables plus nuclear, and as a balanced forces, maybe gas burning generators. But we do expect new technologies, and I think that new technologies that are extremely developing now in world, for example, in US, I mean small module reactors, for example, that will be with a much more higher security level, I guess. And you know, my personal point of view that when world started this nuclear generation, the nuclear waste management, that was the question postponed for the next period of time, and probably that was not transparent and that was not understandable for the society at all. Now we are at least at the half of the way of the solution of this problem. My policy in Ukraine was to accelerate as much as it is possible to work with the transparency and with the work with the management fuel, nuclear fuel, spent management and others. And I guess that it gives, in a perspective, understanding that that is right low carbon way for the future generation.
I'd like to go back to Professor Jasanoff and wondering, in your comparative research, what's an example of a country that you think has gotten it right or is pointed in the right direction in terms of governance of nuclear energy, and what are the components for getting it right?
Thanks, Chris. The components for getting it right are not necessarily coincident with anybody getting it right. I mean, arguably, you should take all the countries that don't have nuclear power and say that they got it right, because it's, and in the way the world stands now, an intrinsically ungovernable technology, one could make that argument, but that's not necessarily where I want to go with it. The way that countries have governed nuclear power has a lot to do with what publics think about it. And I wanted to come back to something that Daniel Poneman said, because I don't want there to be a misunderstanding. I don't think my role on this panel is to be for or against nuclear power. It is to understand more deeply why it is that people accept or reject nuclear power. And, you know, Daniel, that if people accepted the threads, each step in your argument, exactly the way you understand it, then obviously we would be in a different place. So the question becomes not, is it good or is it bad, but why is the logic that is so, you know, pointedly accepted by people who are living this technology every day of their lives on the ground, as you are, why is that so hard to communicate to other people, and why do they not buy into it? And I think there, the analytic world has a lot to offer. It has a lot to offer in terms of how are your institutions organized, who gets to speak in it, what ideas of the public do you carry in your minds as you go about talking to them, and so on and so forth. The nuclear industry is one that gave rise to something that social analysts of risk called the deficit model of the public. This is an idea that it's the public's lack of comprehension that affects their responses to nuclear power. And if you could only feed them the right facts, then they would turn around and accept it. The point about coral reefs, the point about the IPCC, the Mark Twain story, I mean, all of this would make sense to the public if you only gave them the right facts. Well, these facts, I mean, I think it was the Ukrainian minister who mentioned the internet. In any case, these facts are now all available. I mean, anybody can plug into Wikipedia and read everything they need to read about nuclear power. But the public acceptance that you're talking about, I mean, you know, try building a nuclear reactor, generating power in the middle of Mass Ave. I mean, there is something there actually that MIT runs, and it's heavily guarded and secret. It's not generating power, but you know, the knowledgeable citizens do not necessarily want this technology, and you have to understand better why. I think that those structural problems have not actually been dealt with, and until they are dealt with, I'm not sure there's going to be a single country other than the ones that have said no that stand out as models of good governance.
Daniel Poneman, how might you respond?
Well, I certainly agree with the professor, and I was not imputing her as being pro or anti-nuclear. I think all of us in the sector have been mystified and challenged by the challenges that we faced in making the case more widely embraced. There is what seems an atavistic anxiety about the invisible dangers posed by radiation, et cetera, et cetera. People aren't doing simple arithmetic, and I think it's frankly incumbent on people who do think that this has an important role to play to figure out better, not just what we're saying, but what other people are hearing. So I certainly agree with that. I don't necessarily agree with the premise about the level of general acceptance or not. I think that, you still have 94 plants operating in the United States. I think the evidence is that there's a lot of popular acceptance. I think, interestingly, especially there's acceptance where you already have nuclear facilities because people are used to living next door, they get jobs and so forth. It's also, I think, a demonstrated fact that when you do, and maybe this is part of the answer to the conundrum that the professor has posed, when you do involve and engage the affected people at the local level, it really helps. So it turns out that in a place like Finland, which did what Allison MacFarlane was proposing, which was adopt a consent-based approach to nuclear waste disposal, they ended up with 2 communities who are competing for the opportunity to host the repository, far from rejecting it on the classic not in my backyard syndrome. So I strongly accept the need to do that. To me, the thing about the 1.5 degree report and the implications and the need to get to net zero fast just underlines the urgency of the challenge. And let me just end here with one little statistic, which is true both in the case I'm going to say, but globally. In 2011, California got 53% of its electricity from clean sources, non-carbon emitting sources. And after a 7-year push to add a lot of wind and a lot of solar and to really double down on clean economy in their climate, they still had 53% only of their energy from clean sources, because it turns out that the advent of renewables was replacing hydro and nuclear, both of which are non-carbon emitters. So you don't get to zero by treading water and making literally zero progress. And that same statistic, if you have Fatih Birol or the IEA people, that same statistic plays out globally with the massive $1 trillion investment in renewables. We're really not making any progress towards global zero in terms of emissions. So I guess I'll end up by agreeing strongly with the professor. We just have to do a much, much better job of communication, education, and understanding not just what we're saying, but what other people are hearing.
But we're really saying there's a time problem. The present time, even though there are over 90 reactors, there are no new or very few new operations being started. So we've got a time gap. And so this race on climate change, it takes a long time to get new nuclear and also to deal with the acceptance and the many years it takes to get through the regulatory process. And I think one of the questions that comes up and one of the concerns that's come out going back to our 2 accidents, Chernobyl and Fukushima, was the role of human error. And both in the post review on Chernobyl, which said the accident was caused by a remarkable range of human errors, and in the Fukushima Commission, chaired by Professor Kurakawa, where they said that the accident was not a freak of nature, but a profoundly man-made disaster that could and should have been foreseen and prevented. So in terms of safety, what progress has been made in terms of this ever-present problem of human error, which comes up in most of the accidents that get analyzed? Have any comment from Professor Kurakawa? Or one of you, Mr. Poneman, on human error?
Yeah, I agree with those conclusions that were found. And I would say in the case of Chernobyl, there were multiple forms of human error, not only in what happened and the design of the plant, but also in how it was managed as a political matter in terms of communications. And I believe the much greater loss of life that ensued from that accident than the others was in no small measure due to the fact that people were not given the information they needed to keep themselves safe in its aftermath. There have been so many efforts undertaken, at the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and places around the world to deeply study the many failures that led to these accidents. And I think one thing that can't be overemphasized is the importance not only of sort of top-down directives to respond to the human failures to try to prevent them, but this was mentioned sometime earlier, the culture that has to exist of questioning, of not responding to a challenge by covering up or by trying to avoid shutting down an expensive asset because you're afraid that the shareholders won't like. You have to deeply embed the culture of peer review, the culture of openness and transparency. So at every level, from the CEO down to the plant operator on the floor, that they understand that safety must come first. I know there are other people on the webinar. I saw chairman of the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board, Joyce Connery, has been there. You know, these are the people who have to help all of us understand that safety must always be the first priority. And, you know, that applies just as much to aviation, as taken another example, as to nuclear, but it's got to be deeply embedded in the culture of the whole system.
Professor Kurokawa, could you comment also, since your commission really greatly focused on human error?
I really agree with you, but in the sort of cultural background, it's very hard to, in Japanese sort of thing, to make a different opinion in the board meeting or whatever that is to the superiors. And I think you may know the buzzword, obligation to dissent. Always say something different. Do you know what is the motto of this obligation to dissent? Of the credo of a company. This is perhaps everybody knows this company, global company, McKinsey. McKinsey's credo, if you see that, obligation to dissent. So that is a very important element to capture this kind of swallow and understand it.
Do you think that in Japan, there will be a comeback for nuclear, or is it pretty much at a standstill?
No, I guess it direction is coming back. At least we need that and carbon dioxide thing. But I think we really have to nurture the culture of obligation to dissent, which is very hard in Japanese culture.
Any other comments by Minister Semarak?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Daniel. And, you know, I visited Fukushima station when I was a minister, and you probably understand that I was in Chernobyl for dozens of times and learned all the reasons. And my understanding is that we have to increase the role of international institutions over to control in technologies, over to control operation, over to control security and safe issues. And Professor Kurokawa, absolutely agree with you that the culture is a great importance. I saw this visiting Fukushima nuclear station, and the same was during Soviet time in US, in USSR, and international institutions and democratic institutions are the best way to control it and to develop technologies. So we are not in the same position for the previous 10 or 35 years. We are moving fastly, and each our step is bigger and bigger and bigger, but transparency again and international cooperation and international institutes, that is the best thing that we have to use. Thank you.
In terms of the safety components, could you just address briefly the nuclear terrorism question and how much concern there should be in terms of nuclear energy and any of the safeguards that have been put in place in that arena. Anyone want to jump in?
Well, I would just very briefly say, and I've written this, a nuclear terrorist incident would be as devastating to nuclear energy as a nuclear accident is. It's an intrinsic existential threat. My little shameless plug, my last book, Double Jeopardy, Combating Nuclear Terror and Climate Change, posits that humanity faces two existential crises. Right. And both are rooted in, have deep relationship with the atom. One is climate change, which I believe the atom can solve, and one is nuclear obliteration, which the atom can cause. And we just have to, and this actually goes right back to Professor Jasanoff's points earlier. If we want to save the planet from one catastrophe, we got to make sure we don't inadvertently trigger the other one. So the problem, obviously, is that absolute vigilance and success is required. It's not like 60% is good enough. All we have to have is one nuclear terrorist episode, and I'm referring here to with a fission device, not a dirty bomb, which would be also horrible in its own ways. But we just have no substitute whatsoever for eternal, rigorous, intensive vigilance to prevent nuclear terror.
Right.
Professor Karakawa, do you have any comment?
No, I think that is the reason, because I think even remember that 9/11 in New York, that the intention of this, in this very one sort of crazy person, that is really a big target. And that shows you, because in fact, after 9/11, US government warned Japanese government, I think nuclear could become a target of terrorist attack, so that have to be protected by not a policeman, but perhaps military personnel.
We're getting close to our time, and I wonder if all four of you could weigh in on what give an example of something that could be done to reassure the public about the need for nuclear energy in terms of climate change and other aspects of the energy supply. What reassurance or action or lesson learned from these accidents could provide a way forward?
Well, I'll take a crack at that. The classic line is from Professor George Santayana: those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. I think the world is entitled to know that people have drunk deeply from the lessons of all three of these episodes. Obviously, we have the World Association of Nuclear Operators and the INPO organizations that were set up in response to these things. And people have to know that we take, and the whole industry takes safety as the first priority. The second thing is, I do think, and this is where I accept, sort of Professor Jasanoff's challenge in a way, is that people simply have to understand the math and the arithmetic that's involved. And the fact of the matter is that, again, if you take the Paris Climate Agreement, and if you assumed 100% compliance with all of the pledges that were made in the nationally determined contributions, you don't even get close to 2 degrees centigrade. You get to more like the 3.7 degrees centigrade, or even potentially higher. And so I think when people realize that, that will have an effect, and it already has had an effect. You do see a lot more environmental community support for the right kind of nuclear power. And the last thing I would say is, we haven't talked much about it on this panel, but there is a really exciting bow wave of new technologies. I heard some discussion of it on the last panel, of inherently safer small modular reactors that operate at ambient temperatures, and therefore hydrogen explosions are less of a risk, that have fuel designs that use triso little fuel pellets that have multiple ceramic coatings so you don't have the same containment issues and so forth. And I think the more people realize that, I think it will help restore confidence. And frankly, to have people who do have global credibility across a multiple of disciplines like Bill Gates, talking to people about how these things rack and stack in terms of cost benefit analyses, environmentally speaking, safety wise and otherwise. I think it's a process. It's an educational process. It's just that we don't have much time to figure it out because the urgency of the climate crisis is so severe.
Right.
Right, and there's
Could
been discussion.
Chris, could I jump in there?
Yes,
Because I have to leave in a minute, and there's a good deal that I think all of us agree on, and some very fundamental things that we don't agree on. And I just want to sharpen those things that we don't agree on. And that, Dan, this is mainly addressed to you. That is, you seem to think that the way to get to whatever the desired end is, yes, on nuclear power, is to get the rest of the world to understand and follow along your logic. They have to understand the math. Everything we know about the world suggests that that is the wrong way to think about it. The better way to think about it is to realize that people are after very different kinds of things, and most of them are not, frankly, after the next nuclear power plant in their area, whether or not they buy into the idea of climate change. The countries in which there has been success of the sort that you're talking about, like Finland, are countries in which the idea of solidarity and the idea that government will come in and do things on people's behalf are reasonably widely accepted and understood. I mean, these are countries with high degrees of social consensus around a lot of things, and therefore social consensus around nuclear power is not surprisingly easier to build in a place like that. So people like me and others have been arguing that in addition to looking at inherently safe or whatever, I mean, you know, these are terms that have been bandied around in the industry for decades. I know that because this is an area that I follow. But in addition to those things, you have to persuade people that if something goes wrong, somebody is there to help and assist. My understanding of Fukushima is that the citizens who feel that they were adversely affected have not received that kind of assurance from the Japanese government. They have had uphill struggles. The monitoring and following of what exposure has meant, especially to children, has not been satisfying to the people who were uprooted. All over the countryside in Fukushima Prefecture, you see these bags and bags of contaminated soil. And to my knowledge, nobody has explained what's going to happen to these, except perhaps building roads to the Olympics. I mean, you know, there's a lot of unanswered caretaking questions that remain unresolved. What we have proposed in my community is that the technologies of hubris, as we call them, the ones that say we can predict the future and take care of it, be accompanied by an equal attention to what we call technologies of humility. And those are technologies of assessment and scenario building that look at who is going to get hurt and what we're going to do about the people that are going to get hurt. And until we make that kind of an investment, we're going to repeat the same human error, the human error that thinks that there won't be human error. There will be human error. And what are we going to do when human error occurs? So I think that beside the scenario building forward looking that you are all extraordinarily competent at doing, the scenario building from people's needs and desires and fears upward, what are we giving them? What are we telling them that they will, that governments will do for them? Price Anderson is not the answer.
Hey, John. Sorry.
Yes, we're out of time. I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut off the discussion.
Very shortly, two sentences. Very shortly, two sentences. I want to say that nuclear security, that is one of the dimensions of the globalization of the world, and we have to understand this. And the second sentence is that nuclear security, that is the common interest of the government and the civil society, and cooperation between those two parts will lead us to increase this security totally all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the panelists. It's been a
All right.
wide-ranging discussion and I think a good launching pad for the rest of the conference. I'm going to turn it back over to Francesca Giovannini and let her take over the next steps in the conference. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Chris, thank you, and thank you to
Thank-
all your wonderful panelists. What an incredible first day. Well, thank you so much for staying with us for the past 2 hours and a half. We have more to come. In 15 minutes, we're going to join the special session with Director General Grossi and the New York Times National Security Correspondent David Sanger. We are posting now in the chat the link that you need to use to access that session. I also want to remind you that tomorrow we'll continue with 3 panels. First 2 deal with nuclear safety in more in-depth. The first panel is about national perspectives, how countries around the world have in fact understood the accidents of Chernobyl and Fukushima, what lessons they have drawn and what lessons they have implemented or forgotten. The second panel instead talks about the role of international organizations and international fora in strengthening global norms on nuclear safety and security. Now, we recognize that this distinction between country's perspective and international perspective might be a little bit artificial, and you will notice that some of the speakers actually will probably cross between the domestic and international quite a lot. There is a way somehow to organize the structure and the flow of the conversation, and we sincerely hope you'll be able to join us for that. After a humanitarian break of 15 minutes, we will resume with a panel on nuclear security. And as Matt has said in the introduction, we really want to underscore that for us, the interface between nuclear safety and security is in fact one of the cutting edge issues that the nuclear industry and quite frankly also international organizations will have to grapple with. We want actually to ensure the viability, the safety and security of nuclear energy in the 21st century. So we hope you will be able to join us tomorrow. Again, please register for day 2 if you haven't done so. And we will see you in 15 minutes with the forum hosting Director General of the IA, Rafael Mariano Grossi. Thank you so very much and see you soon.